And let me go ahead and welcome all the young scholars. We're delighted to have you in the audience. I'm deliberately being very stark mit dem speakers in order to maximize the amount of question and answer time. And to the organizers, we may go a little bit in the Q&A, a little bit longer than the end of the scheduled time. And anyone who wants to absolutely cut me off, just let me know. Jim?
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm standing in also for Steve Durloff, as Rob said, and I'm going to summarize some of the work. Actually, some of what I'm going to say has already been said, so I can even make my talk shorter, although it was way too long. 2 hours, yeah, not the 3. But I want to thank the organizers of INET and also the members of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group for this interaction. You can think of this in some part as a report. Let me just talk briefly about the goals of this working group. And the goal is very complementary with some of the remarks made by some of the other speakers on this conference. We're trying to promote the study and understand of inequality and what many people call human flourishing. And we want to go beyond the standard rhetoric about redistribution to examine how the capabilities that lead to human flourishing can be created. So we have a longer term perspective. I realize that Keynes has been invoked. I noticed there was a quote from Joan Robinson already contradicting Keynes. I would simply say that even though we may be dead in the long run, our children won't be and their children's children won't be. And we really have to think a broader perspective. And this group is taking a much broader perspective, and it's taking up the challenge that INET has posed to integrate research across disciplines. So I'm going to talk about some research in psychology, epidemiology, genetics, and epigenetics, and talk about how that enriches it. And Rob has already sounded the theme, which is going to be resounded several times in my talk. In fact, my concluding slide has this word, but I'd simply say we are considering all the classical policies. So it's not as if we're waging war on economics or saying that something is terribly wrong with the previous body of tools, but what we're trying to do is supplement that body of tools and consider in particular more than the policies, some of which have been talked about in this conference of redistribution, some of the more traditional policies we heard about last night, and really look at those policies that lead to pre-distribution or that really think about constituting the skills and capabilities of this generation and the next generation, and gets at exactly the kind of question that Ronald was talking about, that intergenerational transmission curve. So we know, and we've been reminded already, that social and economic inequality is increasing, uncertainty about policies. There's a lot of ambiguity about the way the future trends are going, and a lot of political and social uncertainty. In a lot of countries, we know this has created divided societies, not just in the immediate short run, although the crisis has exacerbated it, but in particular, even in long run, we see a serious increase in inequality. Now, we can also say, and this is very important to notice, that even though the words inequality are used, by no means are all the experiences or the experiences of all countries in the OECD bloc even. Certainly when you go outside to developing countries, they're not all the same. Institutions, policies, and compensation strategies differ greatly. But I would argue too that in these matters, it's not just a simple matter, and this is where our session really complements what's been said through the last few days. It's not just a matter of developments in financial markets, although those are very important. And part of our goal is to integrate financial markets and human capital markets in a way that have not been done in the past. But we want to understand too, and I think I would contradict some previous statements, or at least supplement them, by saying that skills are playing a major role in shaping inequality, and policies that promote skills have a very important role to play in reducing inequality, promoting intergenerational mobility, and so forth. So let me put up one slide, which is taken from the American case, and which is in some sense atypical. This is the graph that receives so much attention. These are the 99 versus the 1. If you look, for example, the cumulative growth in after-tax income by income group, these are family incomes now going across all categories, you've seen a huge growth in the top 1%, and a huge growth even among the top 1/10 of 1%. And so there is a real growing inequality. And we can see at the very bottom, real wages have really not kept up, real incomes, and at the top end, it has not. If we look more finely at this compensation, it's not just all CEO compensation. In fact, that's been studied recently by Kaplan. A lot of it does originate in the financial sector in one form or another. So there is some truth. in some of the statements that have been made earlier in the conference. But I would just add something to this discussion to say that this is relatively atypical of many other countries, even in the OECD, that this extreme growth, just to sort of show a very more familiar looking figure taken from OECD statistics alone, and using a somewhat different measure of inequality. This is the so-called 90-10 ratio in terms of wages. Now this is just hourly wages of individuals employed. We can see that the trend rate of growth starting in 1980 that was so characteristic of the US economy was much less true of many other countries. And in fact, in some countries, there really wasn't such a big growth in inequality. And so it's not all the financial market. And I would argue it's very important that we consider skills. There's been real stagnant growth, very stagnant growth in real wages for most workers except the highly skilled. So for example, this figure taken from the US economy is very revealing. It shows that over long periods of time, we've had declining real wages for males among full-time workers. So since the period 1964, we can see that those who are secondary school dropouts are receiving actually lower real wages in terms of than they would have been receiving from 40 or 50 years ago. And that has, of course, received a great deal of attention. So skills are still a major ingredient. And what we also see in a more disturbing pattern is a growing underclass of persons in many countries. And this, on top of it, is a set of problems relating to crime, healthcare costs, immigrant assimilation, and the like. So what I want to argue, and this is the theme of a lot of our work, is that the skills of a country are major contributors to rising inequality. We know that skills are important. Adam Smith said they were important. Every major economist has said they're important. I don't think anybody here, I'm not going to be telling anything new. But what I do say, and Ronald's reminded us of this today in his presentation, that it's been well studied that labor markets have changed, whether or not they're in Europe or whether they're in Asia or whether they're in the United States and Canada. We know that there's been pronounced globalization trends, skill-biased technical change has seriously changed the way the economies are organized, and this is a major contributor. But now what's happened in this, and this builds on a theme that we just heard in the last talk, is that even though there's a demand for skilled labor, and I'll just draw on the American data, and it's not universal, so I don't want to say this is true of every market, but it's broadly true, that what we see is a very puzzling phenomenon. The returns, the economic and social returns have actually increased to investing in education in the United States. Whether it's true for various minority groups or gender groups and so forth, the exact patterns aren't the same, but the general pattern is the same. The numbers are somewhat different. And let me just sort of display this graph in its entirety. And what we see is something very puzzling, which is really something that economists do worry about and should worry about. In the face of what seems to be an increasing increasing return to education, what we actually see is a rise in the dropout rate in the United States. There are more people dropping out of school. And this isn't just people who are immigrants. This isn't a question of just people coming in from Mexico across the border with 6 years of schooling. This eliminates the immigrants. This is actually suggesting that in the face of increasing returns, where some people have computed rates of return of graduating high school as high as 50%, what you're finding is actually an increase in dropping out, not a decrease. And there has been a slow increase in the amount, in the growth of college education, mostly concentrated among women, very flat for men. And this kind of contradicts a lot of what thinking should be about how markets would respond. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the ingredients causing this delayed or sometimes completely retarded response to a rising skill premium? Now, this has a broader question as well. And so if you know the category, what's called NEETs, I don't know, you know what the NEETs are? That's an OECD category about youth that are not in education, employment, or training. These are people who are really kind of outside the mainstream economy. And if you go across different countries in Europe, I'm not sure you can see, I know sitting in the back it's sometimes difficult to see these slides. But if you look at people who are young people, 15 to 24, male and female, you can just separate the two. Might be different factors by those genders. But nonetheless, what you can see is a substantial portion in many economies of people outside any kind of productive activity. They're not going to school, they're not training, they're not employed. And this represents a potentially great waste. And this also is showing up, there's another way to cut this data, just looking at kids separately in the different age categories. And if anything, the category 20 to 24 is actually increasing. More the younger people in school, and we have this group of people getting withdrawn from the economy. And there are many ways to measure it. I'm running low on time, so I won't simply say it, but if you go across age groups, for example, looking at Germany by age, this is now in 2006. These are all pre-meltdown time periods, so I'm not going to build, you can make things much worse by looking post-2008. But what you see is a pattern in Germany and the UK, similar pattern, of a growing group of these youth who are not engaged in the larger economy. And so there has been this sense. Charles Murray, maybe not a favorite of many in the room, has a very nice book, though, Rob and I both agree, called Coming Apart, which documents for the US this polarization, the fact that we are creating two societies. And that should be a source of concern. And there are counterparts in many other countries around the world. So inequality is increasing, and there seems to be more social and economic segregation than before. And as has just been shown, many people, and there's a good basis for realizing that there is a strong intergenerational persistence of inequality of income. So if you compute the ratio of long-term earnings of the son to the father's earnings, so we take this over long stretches of time, the correlation, the degree of association between the father and the son in Denmark is about 0.07, fairly small. Not zero, but there is some real significance, some important. The same figure, the same statistic for the United States is 0.65. So it's almost 10 times larger. And the sense in which current inequality leads to later inequality, intergenerational inequality, is a serious concern. So that's the goal of the network. And that's, I think, a serious problem. And we know, we've heard about Raghu's work and some other work suggesting how certain policies that even had strong effects on financial markets were motivated, at least in part, by concerns over trying to use, not tackling the real wage problem by promoting skills, but actually instead by doing something like giving cheap credit or trying to make some other accommodation for some basic, some economic fundamentals. So the goal of this group, and one of the major themes, is to take a much more comprehensive approach to understanding the skills problem and inequality, and to take a view that recognizes and calibrates and documents what skills matter, how they're produced, and how we should prioritize public policy. And I think there's a great advantage in doing this, and it avoids what I think are currently fragmented policy discussions. Many people, when they talk about policies like healthcare or crime, or talk about problems about teenage pregnancy or immigrant assimilation, typically give you one policy at a time, saying, oh, look, what we want to do is we want to put more police on the street, and that surely will reduce crime. We can also look at strategies, for example, of reducing health care costs by having more doctors and building more hospitals. But the kind of strategy I want to talk about today, and what we're doing, is a unified approach to public policy that addresses these problems in a coherent way, and that addresses all these problems from a common core, understanding the capabilities, some of these powerful capabilities that Amartya Sen was talking about earlier, many others have talked about, provide a way to organize the literature and provide a way to think about how to design policies that have broad gauge implications, that will actually look at many problems, that tackle many problems with the same broad brush. So what's the argument? Let me just sketch the argument and show you some evidence in support of it. The first argument, of course, is the one I already made, the truism that society is based on skills. That these skills are causing lack of skills, and this is very well documented now in a lot of research, not only by our members in the network, but many others as well, that these skills are major contributors, not exclusive contributors by any means. Performance of the economy has a huge role, incentives, wages play a role, but nonetheless, deficits in skills, deficiencies in skills are major problems leading to things like crime, teenage pregnancy, obesity, poor health, failure to assimilate in society. Now the first lesson that's very important, and I'm glad Herb Geddes is here because I'll make reference to some of his work, is that when we think about skill, we have to be much more inclusive than we usually are. Most people, when they think about skill, will think about years of schooling. We had a discussion earlier today where somebody said, well, human capital equals education. But I think Some people, and more enlightened people, say, well, what we want to look at is a score on some achievement test, say an IQ test, or in Europe, a PISA test. But what we understand now, and what we've come to understand, is that cognitive skills are only a small part of what is required for success in life. Personality skills, it goes by various names. Some people call it character, some people call it soft skills, whatever. These non-cognitive skills play a very powerful role. These are things like perseverance, attention, motivation, self-confidence. They're important and they're often neglected. In addition, health and public health. And this is where I'll mention Herb Gentis. Bowles and Gentis have this great book some 35 years ago, I guess, called Schooling in Capitalist America. It was considered kind of outside the mainstream, and so a lot of people didn't read it. But it contained a very important message that schools were producing these soft skills, they were producing these cognitive skills, and then a body of research, initially done by radical economists and then picked up more in the mainstream, showed in fact that these skills are very important. And this whole line of important in success across a number of dimensions. So that's the first message, is that we have to think about skill much more comprehensively. It's not a test score. It's not just a measure of years of schooling. It's really a whole vector of skills. And I would use the word, maybe appropriate the word capabilities, without all the social justice implications, but it has implications for social justice. So that's the first main point. The second main point is these gaps in skills open up at very early ages. And this is what Ronald was talking about, and I think it's very important that we understand this. That gaps open up at early ages, and that the gaps between the advantage and disadvantage frequently open up long before children are even entering schools. So the way we think about inequality and the way we think about strategies to combat it, even skill-based strategies, have to think much more about what happens before people go into school. Now, we know that the family lives of young children are producers of these skills. And we also know that families pass on their genes. So there's always this null hypothesis out there that all of this is genetically determined. And some have said that. That was a more fashionable argument 100 years ago, but it's been made recently in popular books as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. But what we've come to understand is these skills are not fixed at birth. Genetics plays a big role. The behavioral genetics literature is somewhat controversial. Heritabilities are estimated somewhere between around 50%. That seems to be a rule, but there's a lot of evidence that that varies depending on the environment. And so we understand, yes, heritability plays a role. But secondly, these traits, family influence, environment, social environments are playing a very powerful role. So family influences and social influences do have an effect, and that's been documented. And I'll show you a little bit of evidence on that. Now, the reason why this is a source of concern and why we should lead to a somewhat different kind of policy analysis about inequality is that families play an important role. I mean, Plato wrote about this in the New Republic, and not the New Republic, the Republic. That's a more recent contributor. Sorry about that. I guess Amartya Sen was writing in the New Republic. But the fact is, this has been noted for generations. But what has not been understood is the exact mechanisms of family influence. And here, I think, we've made some real progress. And so we learn that when we think about policies to combat inequality, especially long-run inequality, we have to understand the family and the mechanisms of family influence. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about this line of research and what we've come from it. But what we have come to understand in terms of what economists now call the technology of skill formation is the idea that there basically is a life cycle dynamics. You can think of the term of synergies, if you like Buckminster Fuller, but these synergies or dynamic complementarities, skill begets skill, motivation begets motivation, and their feedback that occur at different stages across the life cycle. More motivated children learn more. I'll show you an example of that. We've also come to learn that as the child gets older, as the human being gets older, learning can go on until the oldest ages. Neurogenesis occurs into the 80s and 90s. We know even people very ill with cancer still are producing new skills. But nonetheless, new neurons. Learning can go on at all ages. But the efficiency of that is actually reduced. So what we need to do is understand better than we do now the idea that lives do have a life cycle focus, that there are targets of opportunity, and we can be more effective or less effective depending on how well we build our knowledge and policies based on that. So then we need to understand that inequality in families and plays a very important role. So let me just show you a little bit of evidence on this point. First of all, let me just show you some evidence on the importance of what are called both cognitive and character skills. There's been a lot of work on this. Armin's involved on this. You've even, I think, put some of the questions on the German socioeconomic panel now, and you've analyzed these, showing, for the German case, strong and powerful predictive patterns of these non-cognitive traits and explaining a range of behaviors, wages, and so forth. But let me just show you, and since the session is technically about employment, just some lessons. I don't know if you can see this. It's a little bit tight, but what you can see is I've just extracted from a large body of evidence, which I will flit through because I'm the last speaker, the last session of the conference, so it's unwelcome to make this too long. But let me just show you, if you look at this graph here, what it's showing, and this is going to be typical of several, is you move from the bottom of the distribution to the top. This is American data. You look at employment by age 30. You can see somewhat of a relation between pure measures of cognition and probability of employment. There's a gradient. Non-cognitive skills, and this is a summary measure, a broad set of measures, play a huge role too. And in fact, the theme of all these slides, which I'll just skip through, is, for example, if we look at crime, one of the best established correlations has been this notion of IQ and criminality. But we also know when we look at measures of these non-cognitive skills that if you go from the bottom of the distribution, on the left side of the figure, to the top of the distribution, you see very powerful improvements, much less likely for people to go to jail. And so without beating this to death, but using the same measures across a variety of outcomes, that's the key idea. There really are core sets of capabilities that are producing these things. You get a similar pattern in terms of teenage pregnancy. That if you move down the up the distribution in terms of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, you reduce the probability of teenage pregnancy. If you look, for example, at something like election participation, whether you're not participated in the 2006 election, again, this is American data, both cognitive and non-cognitive skills matter. Who drops out of school? Just graduating out of secondary school, we know that's a very powerful determinant of life. Who graduates from, well, let me just, four-year colleges and the like. We see very, very strong patterns as we move from the bottom of the distribution to the top. So these things matter. Now, there's a case study of this, which I'm completing a book on. I have to advertise a little bit. There's something in the United States called the GED program. You probably don't have I don't think you have a counterpart for it in Germany. But there is something which is a program is given to kids, high school dropouts. It's a test. And it's a test that's premised on what a lot of social policies are premised on. Namely, that if you pass a test at a certain level, and your testing level is about that of a high school graduate, you're as good as a high school graduate. And the GED is actually a brilliant test. I'll just show you. This graph shows very well. By the way, about 12 to 13% of all secondary school graduates in the United States are GEDs each year. So this is a huge contribution to the skill, quote, skill gap in the United States, because these GEDs really aren't having such skills, as I'll show you. But if you look at the measure of cognitive skill, and you plot those people who are secondary school graduates, and compare the GEDs, where they are in the distribution, you'll see that the GED distribution and the secondary school graduate distributions are about the same. The uncertified dropouts have a distribution off to the left. They're just not as smart. And psychometrically, the GEDs are basically the same as high school graduates. And there are a lot of studies showing that. So that's been documented in numerous studies. And yet what's amazingly interesting as a simple experiment is the GEDs are earning at the rate of dropouts. They're not earning at the rate of high school graduates. They actually earn at the rate of dropouts. And in fact, what's interesting, if you just ask, one of the reasons why people take the GED is they want to go on to college and graduate. Bill Cosby is a GED. There are some people who actually went forward and successfully completed the programs. But the fact of the matter is most of these GEDs, they try, but they fail. About 40% attempt, only about 4% actually succeed in going on. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is if we look at measures of non-cognitive skills, we actually see that there are substantial gaps between the GEDs and the uncertified dropouts. In fact, on a variety of measures, which I'm not showing here, just summarizing, in terms of teenage behavior, in terms of various kinds of pathological behavior, in many dimensions, the GEDs are worse than ordinary high school dropouts. The U.S. Armed Forces won't even take GEDs. The Marines say they're too violent, they're too undisciplined to be U.S. Marines. So what do we know? What this shows us is that the reliance on achievement tests, I know that comes as a whimsical remark, but I gave this at Annapolis a few years ago, and that resonated. You can't get into Annapolis with a GED, I promise you. But what's interesting is that this kind of reliance is not, this is just not a one-off occasion, to use the term. What it is actually something that is used pervasively. We use the achievement test to monitor how successful schools are, how successful people are, how successful countries are. The PISA scores are always a source. And in the US, when we count GEDs as dropouts, and we actually eliminate them as being high school graduates, we can actually see that the African American high school graduation rate in 2010 is no different than it was in 1960. And what's more interesting is that the major source of the improvement for the African American high school graduation rate as measured, counting the GEDs as graduates, is growth in the GED in the prison population. There's been an enormous explosion in the prison population. So this is just one example of an uncritical reliance on these tests. Let me then just talk briefly, which we've already seen the interesting slide. Alan Kruger was talking recently about the Great Gatsby curve and so forth. We see there's been a lot of interest about the emphasis on income inequality as a major determinant of child disadvantage. And there's been a lot of emphasis in saying, well, there is inequality, we should do something about the inequality. And I think we should. But I hope that we don't repeat, or the world doesn't repeat, some of the mistakes that the US repeated. That it's not just a matter of transferring income. It's not just a simple matter of redistribution. Some 40 or 50 years ago, during the Great Society, we did exactly that in the US. There was massive redistribution. Inequality went down, there was no question about it. But intergenerational persistence of inequality did not go down. And the mechanism that actually produced escape led to, I mean, there was no mechanism. That was not it was not just income. And in fact, when the Clinton administration basically ended welfare as we knew it, it was operating on the premise that that was a failed policy. It was not successful in producing intergenerational mobility. Now, why is that? It's not just income. So what do we know about skill gaps, these gaps that matter so much? Let me just show you a couple of statistics that I think are quite important. A lot of people are concerned about the exclusion of minorities from American society. And so, for example, it's well documented, and these are the figures. Okay, oh, yes, sorry. But basically, we see substantial differences between blacks and whites in who actually goes to college. There's a 12-point difference, 12-point difference in terms of the proportion of blacks going to college and Hispanics going to college. Once we control for their ability, measured at the time they're going to school, we actually see an effective affirmative action policy. They're actually more likely to go to college, everything else the same. Ability gaps are playing a huge role. And since I've run out of time, I would say something similar goes on in terms of wage gaps. I'm not saying that all inequality is caused by that, but I'm saying that a substantial part is. Let me just race through the remaining 25 minutes of my talk. And let me just talk, show you a couple of points that I think are extremely important. So these abilities are playing a very important role. These gaps open up very early. And this is the next point I want to make. This is a graph taken from a study. There are many such graphs of this type. If you go to the website here for our Human Capital Inequality group, you'll see these here. This is basically looking at test scores of children classified by their mother's educational attainment level. And so you can see on the top scores, this is scores on an achievement test, but we have a lot of other measures on both cognitive and non-cognitive measures, very similar gaps. And if you look at it, you'll see that those advantaged kids are getting very high test scores. The very bottom of the graph, the kids who are very disadvantaged. So that's a pretty well-established pattern. That pattern is there at age 18 when these kids are applying to college. But it's also, the most interesting thing is that it's there at age 5, and it's also there at age 3, which is about as early as you can reliably measure these gaps. And so these gaps are there. They play a very, very important role. And the schools, which are, of course, quite unequal in the United States, are not really doing a lot. There's some movement in those graphs. They're not doing a lot to sort of either increase or decrease those gaps. Okay, so what do we know? Give me a few more minutes. I got it. Remember, I'm speaking for Durloff. Durloff has another 20 minutes, so no. I'll switch to his talk in a second. So let me just remind you of a few statistics. And this is true of, actually, this is a global trend. It's not just a trend in the United States, but I'm showing you some US data. There's been a huge growth in the percentage of the population which is actually living in households where the parents had never been present. And in this figure of 41% of all births to kids, to unmarried women in the United States has its counterpart in Mexico of like 55%, Chile, Taiwan, very high rising. This is a phenomenon around the world. And with some dispute, and I don't have really time to discuss it, maybe it'll come up in the discussion, it's true in OECD countries, and they even commonplace that, well, the cohabiting status is almost like the marital status, has recently been studied very hard in Denmark. I was at a conference recently, and we saw that that was not true, that even the married state plays a role. Oh, so what are the consequences of this? Let me just show you, for example, one consequence. This is some work by Hart and Risley that shows when a child is growing up in a relatively disadvantaged family, and we ask sort of what's the exposure that the children what is kind of the verbal bath the children are getting, and you'll see enormous differences between those who actually grow up. So if you look, for example, I don't know if you can see it, a high level of mother's speech leads at the age 26 months to much larger child vocabularies, contributing to that gap than at age than those with less. And just to show the summary statistics from the work of Hart and Risley, if you look at kids, welfare kids, working class kids, professional kids, you ask by the time they're 4 years of old, how many words, 4 years of age, how many words have they heard? We're going from 13 million for those disadvantaged to 45 million. Huge gaps that are opening up. So I've got to say one thing about heritability, because that's always the null hypothesis. And again, Herb has worked on this, so I feel that Herb should be here, not me, but nonetheless, I hope I'm representing him. There is a question about when you look at these correlations, how much of this is heritability? And many people would make that argument still today. Say the genes are just being passed across generations. Smart parents get more educated, they pass their genes on. Their kids are smart because of the genes, not because of anything the parents did. And here's where we have another piece of evidence that's extremely important, which actually helps me summarize the arguments, and maybe I'll conclude when, 10 more minutes, thank you. So there's a program in the United States. It's an experimental intervention. The experimental intervention is extremely interesting. It's a peri-preschool program. Low IQ children in a suburb outside of Detroit, Michigan, were basically given what we can think of as enriched parenting. It's actually a strategy that was, in ex post, we can see was targeted towards improving non-cognitive skills. Kids were randomly assigned into treatment and control and were followed to age 40. Fortunately, you should be pleased to know the NIH is going to give us some money now to follow these people through age 50. So we're going to have a longer-term follow. So we have long-term studies. This is not a short-term evaluation. This is long-term evaluation. We have many measures. And for those of you who are still believing in IQ, here's the Perry program. Here's the pattern. This was a very familiar program, or Head Start for many of these programs. If we use IQ or cognition, we see a big surge during the early years. They were low IQ kids. That was the criterion for being in the program. The IQ surged in the first few years in the program, ages 3 and 4. By age 10, they're no smarter. Yet, if we look at the treatment effect, and there's a huge literature on this, and we've actually documented it, you can actually measure the non-cognitive skills. You can actually see that even on achievement test scores, this is a subtlety I probably shouldn't get into in my -1 minute, but what you're going to see is basically the achievement scores are going on, but not the IQ. What's going on? Because achievement test in part embodies knowledge. It involves how much curiosity the child has. This program stimulated that. So if you look at the treatment effects, by the way, there's a very rigorous benefit cost evaluation. We can compute the rate of return to this program as 6 to 10% per year. So let me just, I will really conclude here. Let me just talk about the technology. This is kind of showing schematically this synergism I was talking about before. So there are dynamic complementarities. These early investments feed on later investments, and they produce then what I think are huge investment opportunities that need to be fully understood and capitalized on. We've also understood, if we look at rates of return, that if we wait very long and we start trying to remediate with cognitive interventions, especially in the later years, what we're finding is essentially very, very low rates of return. Job training, like reducing classroom size has been estimated to have a negative rate of return, for example. If you look, for example, at active labor market programs, like Job Corps for the United States, there's a 0% rate of return. And what we now see is basically a strategy understanding that if we are going to intervene, it should probably be in non-cognitive skills related to some work in neuroscience. I would just say that if we look at returns to education, here I can only break this up. The total return to education, this is post-compulsory education in Britain. These are now kids in their 40s. Just going beyond the compulsory year, you can break down the effects of education. This is very well documented. It's the total bar between just the total returns. You get a huge effect of education on wages. You get a huge effect, for example, on employment, on health behaviors, and depression, smoking, and the like. But when you resolve those components into factors that are determined early in life versus those in later in life, a huge chunk of what we think of as the return to education, the so-called causal effect, actually disappears, and it's actually due to those early life factors. So I will conclude, but I would just show you two last figures, okay?
That's it.
I'll do that.
That's it.
Here, I'll just summarize this and just try to interpret what this figure is showing, though. So if, for example, you look at, oops, doesn't really show my label. All right, yes, it does. So if you look at, for example, the returns to a unit euro invested, this is a hypothetical experiment, but it's crystallization from a lot of evidence, a lot of data. And what this is doing is it's doing a thought experiment where we're taking the first euro, say we're investing in children, giving them €1 at each stage in their life. Then you're asking, what's the highest return? Should I put another euro? Where do I get the highest return? In the early years, the later years, schooling, job training, and the like. And the answer is you get extraordinarily high returns in the early years for the following reason. It's the dynamic synergy. You're building the skill base to make later investment very productive. This figure doesn't say that you shouldn't have schooling. In fact, the rate of return on schooling for the high ability kids has been estimated to be as high as 22 to 25% per annum. So you're getting very high returns. But it comes for those people who got that initial skill base, and that's built into this diagram. So it's the dynamics that we have to understand. It's not just education. So I've given most of my message. I will just conclude with this slogan that Rob and I love very much. But people were talking about Cambridge in the 1970s and talking about redistribution. I have nothing against Cambridge in the 1970s or now. But what I do want to say is that it's more than just a question of thinking about how to redistribute a fixed pie. That what we have now is a set of policies available to expand the skill base and to operationalize the idea of capabilities, to move beyond the idea of saying things are genetically determined, that these things, that we have to be passive agents of biology or some social conditions. And I think that's the exciting part of this agenda. So I welcome you all to join us in this venture, and I'm grateful to INET for supporting this venture, and I look forward to many future discussions and exchanges and the exchange in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.